Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. There's a lot of things that set us apart from each other, but when the differences that should be accepted as nothing more than nature's choice become the reasons for discrimination, there's a problem. Colorism in this regard continues to be a reason why fair skin is preferred not just in many cultures, but the beauty industry, the entertainment industry, and also in workspaces that have nothing to do with the appearances of a person. On today's show, we try to understand how this global perception of light and fair being better has come about historically and through the evolution of our societies. So let's jump right into the conversation. Joining us for it is Professor Rashawn, who is a senior lecturer in Near East and Asian Studies and Global Studies, and is also the director of Global Studies at Wayne State University in Detroit. He is the co-author of the book, What's Going On Here? U.S. Experiences of Islamophobia Between Obama and Trump. He joins us from Detroit. Also joining us is Professor Rashawn, who's a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland, and David M. Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution. He joins us from Washington, D.C. A very, very warm welcome to both of you. Professor Rashawn, let's jump right into the conversation. But before that, we need to create a bit of a distinction between colorism and racism. How do those two things differ in your opinion?
So racism obviously is a social construct that's rooted in the way in which we identify people, these broader racial categories. So in the United States and throughout the world, that might be how we call someone white or Caucasian versus Black, Asian, Latino, Hispanic, and the like. Colorism, differently from racism, but related, colorism is about skin tone. It's also about phenotype, the phenotypic features that people have. And so I published a study with Dr. Stephen Foy where we looked at colorism and we looked at the differences between colorism and racism, or particularly racial identification. And we used professional sports, basketball in the United States. And we found that colorism and skin tone was one of the main determinants in how commentators talk about players. So colorism has transference, as you mentioned, to a lot of the outcomes that we care about, from education to work. Skin tone matters for who gets hired, for who gets promoted. And skin tone even matters for the prison sentences that people get and whether or not a person is more likely to get the death penalty in the United States.
Wow, that is such a loaded answer there, and there's so much to try to understand from it, how skin tone and the variance of it can even determine the death penalty for some individuals. I'm going to come back to that. But Professor Saeed Khan, when we talk about this global perception that's been created that light and fair skin is better even amongst race groups, where do you think that came about and the origins of that? Can we trace those?
Well, there's always been, as Dr. Ray so eloquently said, racism. I mean, if you look back even at Aristotle, talking about categorizing people, categorizing slaves based on physical attributes. It wasn't necessarily one of skin color, but the stronger were considered to be perhaps less intelligent, more industrious, more productive. And then there were correlations between physical characteristics and moral disposition. And we see that even happening today, where people make these inferences that foreigners or aliens or people of certain race impugning their sense of hygiene, impugning their sense of refinement, if you will. But then there's the other aspect of racism that has persisted, and that is the presumption that human beings are in fact composed of different stock, superior or inferior. Now, when we're talking about the more modern aspects of racism, clearly there's a correlation to the colonial experience. It was definitely incumbent upon Europeans to try to otherize and inferiorize communities and societies that they were seeking to overlord. It behooved them, especially several thousands of miles away from their home base, to go ahead and assert into the local populations that they were inferior compared to their colonizers. And unfortunately, this became internalized. by many groups, whether it was in South America, whether it was in Asia, or whether it was in Africa. And we see the legacy of the colonial era of creating these kinds of hierarchies existing. But I wouldn't want to go ahead and place all the blame on Europe. We see this happening also, for example, in the Indian subcontinent,
right,
where as the Aryan invasion came into South Asia, the indigenous populations, as they were driven further into the south, were not only otherized, were not only inferior, but that racial hierarchy was actually then codified into both cultural and religious texts and scriptures. And that now, thousands of years later, has created then religious systems, which forces people to accept their station in life, their caste, and the hierarchy and the superiority of those above them.
Professor Saeed Khan, there's so much variance in all of the traditions and the cultures and the religions, but I just want to broadly get your insight on the connotations and tags used to describe those who have a darker skin tone, and especially when we're talking about the subcontinent, and those who have a lighter skin tone. A lot of tags and labels attached to both of those. Can you take us through them?
Well, probably one of the best examples of seeing this distinction is in the excellent Spike Lee movie Malcolm X of nearly 20 years ago, where as Malcolm Little is in prison, his mentor shows him a dictionary and shows him the vocabulary that is used to define white and the definitions and the various synonyms of black. And so when we see these contrasts that are presented, again, these are things that are then internalized among people, and somehow or the other, particularly with the kind of assertiveness and the aggression of the lighter-skinned groups as they came into the subcontinent, as Europeans came into their colonial experiment, we find then that as those people are being vanquished, as the locals are being defeated, they then take on this confession of inadequacy, feeling as though those who are conquering us must be superior, and then inferring that perhaps part of that has to do with their lighter skin color. So we see that there is a kind of a dual conspiracy going here, that it's not only that of the overlords and the aggressors, but also, unfortunately, the internalization of seeing that there's something inherently, intrinsically, biologically inferior about being of a darker skin color, even though, as we see, having a darker skin color certainly helps prevent human beings from some of the more nefarious aspects of climate. They are much more adaptable to harsh environmental conditions. But again, we see that there's been inversion sociologically.
But Professor Saeed Khan, so when you say that all these things, darker skin tones being more resistant to all these aspects, it seems like that justification could have also been used, interestingly enough, to justify why these people should be out in the fields doing hard labor.
Oh, absolutely. But again, this then becomes a matter of cause and effect. Their melanin production had everything to do with the fact of where they have been for generations upon generations. So the idea of them being industrious, for them being in agriculture-based societies was fine. But I think the point that you're making is very important, because they at least had the agency to decide whether they wanted to be in the fields, being productive in cultural pursuits, as opposed to being enslaved, as opposed to being indentured into these positions for somebody else and for someone else's profit.
Professor Rashawn, when we're talking about the internalization of the stereotypes that are imposed, and when agency is taken away from you to actually define who you are, you aren't able to make that decision. That internalization, how do we see that play out in modern day dynamics, where we see that slavery is being rebunked? We do see that people do recognize racism, and yet there's so much subtle language that's surrounding these issues.
Your point, and Professor Khan just highlighted this. I mean, the stereotypes associated with people's skin tone based on whether or not they're darker or lighter skin. And this is one of the things that Stephen Foy and I highlighted in his paper. If athletes or basketball players were lighter skin tone, they were more likely to be referred to as being clever, as being crafty. That's really highlighting their intellectual superiority. On the other hand, darker players were more likely to be discussed about their physicality, their athleticism, their size and their strength. And interestingly, that there really weren't any differences in the size and strength of those players. The problem there then becomes the internalization of those stereotypes, that people understand that skin tone matters. They understand that some people, simply because they're lighter, they get a currency, they get a premium in society. Again, from everything from who is viewed as beautiful to who gets a job to who might get a longer prison sentence. That internalization then impacts people's mental and emotional health. And then it can also impact their physical health. We've seen this throughout Africa, Asia, and even the Middle East, where people go through drastic measures to bleach their skin. Even in South America, one of the best examples of this is Sammy Sosa, who was the former Major League Baseball player. He isn't even really recognizable right now based on what he's done to his skin tone. And it has roots, as Professor Khan said, in colonial slavery, and who not only was put on the inside and outside, but we have to be very clear that part of thinking about intraracial prejudice and discrimination, meaning people within the same group discriminating against one another, stems from the fact that colonial slavery oftentimes led to multiracial lineages where slave masters and colonizers privileged those who they actually birthed, oftentimes due to rape and force.
Dr. Rashawn, I hear you there, and as you say that what happens within races, those conversations that happen, there is a conversation to be had how within the Black community, there is prejudices by those who are dark-skinned towards lighter-skinned individuals as well. How does that dynamic play out?
So in the United States, the one-drop rule is still alive and well. People have to realize that colorism was baked into the laws and regulations that we have in the United States that then spread throughout South America and the Caribbean, and then also has extensions, obviously, to Africa, the Middle East, and Asia as the United States has become a world power. The one-drop rule stated that if you had one drop of Black blood, you were indeed then Black. So what that means is that the skin tone continuum for Black people is vast, similar to the way that it is for people who are from the Middle East or Asia, people who are Latino. And then within the Black community, if you were lighter skinned during the slave era, you were more likely to work in the house because oftentimes you might have been the slave master's son or daughter. But if you were darker skinned, you were in the field. And that lineage has transferred over, even within the Black community, to social organizations, to Greek organizations in terms of fraternities and sororities on college campuses, which were some of the main ways that Black people were able to gain upward mobility. They would use what's called the brown paper bag test. If a woman was lighter than a brown paper bag, then she was able to be accepted into the organization. If she was darker, she wasn't. And so we were talking about Spike Lee's movies earlier. Another movie as phenomenal is called School Days, which really highlights the ways that skin tone manifest within the Black community.
Thank you so much for that insight there. It's something we're going to continue on into the next segment. But before I end the segment, Professor Saeed Khan, I want your insight into the South Asian context, and something that is very prevalent, something you are of course aware of, is the beauty standard, and especially when it comes to marriage. How had colonialism impacted that perception? Something that we see millions of women suffering from, not being able to get married to the person they want, being degraded. It's very centric to the conversations we have here. Did colonialism have an influence and impact into those issues of today?
Absolutely, and I would suggest that it probably had a far deeper impact within the South Asian Muslim community, where before the advent of colonialism, there was at least still this conceit that Muslims were equal irrespective of region, irrespective of color, etc. The British colonial system then helped to codify existing hierarchies that were in fact based on colorism, as was the case with Hinduism. And we find then that it may not necessarily just be the skin color, but it could be the family's last name. Many of these things then serve as triggers to see, as Professor Ray said, a different form of the one-drop rule. If you had a polysyllabic last name, perhaps you came from a quote-unquote darker part of the subcontinent. Hassan Minhaj, the American comedian, had a very insightful segment on his show talking about this kind of internal racism that exists, and particularly speaking about his South Asian experience, that the old guard could be dismissed as saying it is just them, it is a generational issue. But unfortunately, this is something that we see even in younger generations, that people, particularly in the so-called diaspora, who do not necessarily have connections to the subcontinent as intimately or as physically as perhaps their parents or their grandparents, they're buying into the color wheel as well, where you see even within a family, insults being thrown among children based on their color. So we find then that the rationale and the causation of this kind of color-based racism can be attributed in part to the colonial experience and how the British ruled India. But I think it's far more complex than that. And when we see here in the United States colorism being placed, it's not just displaced immigration, it's also unfortunately appropriating the rather nefarious racial history and narrative of this country as well.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Saeed Khan, Professor Rashawn Ray, for such insight into the historical background to the manifestation of colorism, the discrimination based on it that we see today, how it's unfolding. In the next segment, we're going to talk about how this impacts us today in our modern realities, in our workspaces, in our culture, in the entertainment we see. But we're going to discuss that right after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back. So we just took a bit of a historical overview of why we see discrimination on the basis of skin tones. Now we're going to discuss the legacy of the biases and the prejudices of the past continuing into our realities today. How and why does colorism impact the lives of men and women today? Let's discuss. Joining us for this conversation is Amber Starks, who's an Afro-Indigenous activist, a cultural commentator, a decolonial theorist, and the owner of Conscious Coils Natural Hair Salon in Portland. She joins us from Los Angeles. Also joining us today is Jarrett-Bryan, who's an award-winning journalist and the host of It's All Blackademic. He joins us from Brixton. Thank you both for joining us, and a very, very warm welcome to the show. Jordan, let me just jump to you first. In the previous segment, we talked about the historical roots, slavery, colonialism, which has led to the perceptions regarding lighter skin tones, darker skin tones that we see today. But when we talk about how these actually play out in different spaces, workspaces, in our cultural conversations, how do you see the major impact of them?
I think the media impact of how different Black people and their skin tones are seen has been largely and for a long period a negative one. I think we are still in a time where we view darker skinned people as somehow more aggressive, more violent, more loud. And I think even sometimes, as I've seen in my workplaces, incompetent. We link someone being darker skinned to being incompetent with a particular job or a role. So I think generally, they were still suffering from a negative legacy, and there were negative connotations that translate to actual and physical and tangible results when we're talking about darker skinned people in the workplace. I think there are also some issues regarding dating and relationships. Some of my circles of friends still have the perception that if they're guys and they like women, if they're going for a Black woman, the lighter skinned or the lighter skinned that Black woman is, that is somehow a higher sign of how more attractive she is, which is nonsense to me. So I think it's not only prevalent in the workplace of how darker skinned people are seen. I think it's in society, and I use the example of dating and relationships in a wider context as well. Right.
Stay on that point, because you open up a very interesting segue into us discussing how this impacts the both genders differently. And Amber, I'm going to take this to you. While it is, of course, a society-wide issue, how does colorism impact women differently and distinctly from men?
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand how patriarchy and racism intersect and how women are seen as, being the object of like men's desire. And I think that it's important to understand that, when it comes to colorism, the closer you are to whiteness or your proximity to whiteness under patriarchy and under racism, the better you are, right? The more attractive you are, the more beautiful you are. So that's why we see things like skin lightening products that encourage women more often than not to, lighten our skin so that we can be more attractive to men. And this is Black men, white men, men of all colors, because we were taught that whiteness equates to beauty. And so I think that, with women feeling like that we need to be desirable to men, I think we are often taught that if we are lighter skinned, we hold more currency and therefore we're more attractive, therefore we're more likely to be considered suitable for marriage and even for, having children. So I think that we always have to consider how racism and patriarchy intersect and how much more than women are seen as needing to kind of, get in line and be attractive by being lighter, if that's an option.
Right. Amber, you work in the fashion and the beauty industry, and we are hearing a lot of talk about, acceptance and the need to accept darker skin tones. We just don't want poster women representing each and every woman and their experiences. How much of it do you think is lip service, and how much of a genuine change do you think is coming about in the beauty industry?
So I definitely think that Black women in particular are learning to, instead of pivoting towards, industry and pivoting towards, other people's desire, we're kind of we're deciding that we want people to pivot towards us. We want industries to pivot toward us. We're kind of decentering whiteness. We're decentering industries that have marginalized us for such a long period of time. I think that, we're learning that self-acceptance and, love for ourselves has to be rooted outside of these like oppressive structures. So I think as far as like, is this genuine change? I would say for Black women, that ownership of our identities and our self-acceptance is a genuine thing. I do have concerns about whether, industries are just being performative because this has to do with like capitalism, and seeing that it's kind of a buzz or a trending thing. You see these major corporations starting to make products that, encourage, Black women to like love ourselves and love our, our Black skin. But I think really, to be honest, I think it's, Black women and darker skinned women who are deciding for ourselves that we're tired of trying to, pivot towards these companies and, and then pivot towards, I think, white supremacy in general. I think that we have a voice, within our own communities that we're building up each other. And I think the internet has a lot to do with that.
Right, Amber, stay with me on that point. Stay with me on that, because you raise a very, very essential point, which is trying to understand this issue, not just, for what it is, but trying to see how it intersects with the economy, how capitalism is playing a role in it. Jordan, from your lens, from your cultural aspect into this, from your expertise when we talk about culture and we talk about capitalism and the need to reclaim your identity, all of this combined, where do you see things headed?
I think as my fellow panelist there mentions, there's definitely an intrinsic link between capitalism and colorism, and I think that a lot of that is down to the fact of, for years and years and years, products have been sold on television adverts, on billboard adverts, with models and people of a particular skin tone as being seen as this is the kind of person we want to advertise our product. Because if we want to sell a product, the person selling the toothpaste or the beer or the dog food has to be of a certain skin tone, and invariably that skin tone has been someone who's been of a lighter skin tone. I think what we're seeing now is that a lot more Black people have their own business, have their own products, and they're deciding themselves who's going to be the face of what they're selling and how capitalism works for them, as opposed to always being a subservient to a corporation that decides who is the face of their particular product. But I think, just going back very briefly to the question before last that you asked the other guest, I think there's definitely an advantage in being darker skinned that works for Black men that doesn't work for Black women. I still think that a lot of Black men are fetishized in a way that works for them. So there's still this idea, I think, amongst a lot of women that dark skinned men are, dark chocolate, we're stronger, we're more physical, we're more sexy, in a way that I think for Black and dark skinned women, they're still seen amongst a lot of men as troublesome, aggressive, assertive, loud.
Jordan, let me pick up on to that point, because this fetishization that you're talking about is an important point. How that's being worked all around the world, this need to pick up on that identity, capitalizing on it, that also is an important aspect in this conversation. Give us more examples of that. How do you think that's happening?
I think in terms of dating relationships, it's always happened, but I just think it goes back to my initial point. I think for years and years and years and years, we have been fed this line that darker skinned Black people is bad and light skinned Black people are welcome and are positive. And I think when you reinforce that for decades and centuries, you internalize it to start to believe it. Hence why a lot of dark skinned Black people are bleaching, because they see themselves and their skin tone as a bad thing, as something that's ugly and negative. I think what's changing now is just seeing a lot more Black people understanding the beauty of their skin tone, of their color, and the fact that just because they're my complexion or even darker, that is what they are. It's not bad or good. It is what it is. Accept it and love it, as opposed to judging it and trying to change it. So I think there's a lot more reclaiming of identity and how Black people see themselves now, and not worrying so much about the darker I am, the better or worse I am. I'm a dark-skinned Black man. I think I'm quite handsome and good looking, but regardless of that, I am who I am, and I'm very comfortable and happy in who I am. I think more Black people need to understand that, and that will impact on how they treat other people and indeed raise their kids.
Definitely. Amber, I want to go back to a point you made about, brands trying to perhaps capitalize on this movement. And I want to understand this distinction, because this is a conversation that keeps on coming up. How do we differentiate between a genuine effort to represent someone, represent their culture, what they stand for, and what we call cultural appropriation, and just, trying to capitalize on it for the moment because it's the hot topic?
Yeah, I think, when you're trying to bring people into, your fold, representation, not just for selling the product, but people who work for you, who can give you an understanding of the people that you're trying to, actually serve or, provide services to. I think that cultural appropriation is really about exploiting, it's just an exploitative measure, right? Companies who are simply just trying to sell as many products aren't going to make sure that they have staff, they're doing the research, they're talking to Black communities, and they're investing in Black communities. And when I say Black, I want to make sure we're speaking globally, because, sometimes we might center Western countries of people of African descent, but I'm also talking about, our brothers and sisters in, New Zealand, Southeast Asia, places where Blackness is maybe viewed differently. But I think that cultural appropriation is about stealing. It's about theft. It's about commodity, right? You're commodifying these people so that you can, gain from them, versus learning, versus willing to change, cultural practices within your, corporation or organization. And so I think that cultural appropriation is about stealing and taking ownership of people's culture and their identity, without giving them credit. And also, maybe also not reconciling past mistakes that you as a corporation or organization has made in harming those communities, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's really about continuing to marginalize and disenfranchise while also exploiting,
Right. So you're trying to take the good out of that helps sell your products without actually bringing about that true inclusivity. Jordan, let me talk about entertainment and talk about the people at the top, those who do represent people of color, people like me, people like you. They represent differences. Do you think they are doing enough being in that industry? Because sometimes the change does need to come from the top as well.
Yes, I agree. I've always got the mindset that I feel that people in positions of power and influence do have some responsibility when there's social injustices happening, and they can amplify their voices and their position to enforce some kind of social change to do that. Concurrently, I'm not someone that also wants to tell a person what to do with their life. If you don't want to speak out about certain social issues, I'm not going to force you to do that. But I think that in a time, in particular this year, where there's so much racial tension and there's so much racial awareness about what's happening to people like myself and yourself, I think that if you are an entertainer in a position of power, if you are not using that position to highlight and indeed try to change things, what we're seeing in the NBA is they're not content now with just actually talking about the fact that black men and black women are being persecuted by the police. That LeBron James, the basketball player, has set up an organization that actually funnels people to vote. That actually isn't just about platforming and showcasing and profiling the problem. No. Here's a situation to actually try and solve the problem as well. And I have a lot more respect for people that do use their platform. And you could say, LeBron James and other rap stars and entertainers are multimillionaires. They can afford to be sidelined for 6 months and not be financially hit. Okay, but there are other people I know in this country who are not financially secure and stable, who have a small profile and are still using their profile to try and highlight issues that are wrong with the world, but also implement actual tangible solutions too. So I think there is a responsibility, more so now than ever, on people with positions of power and a profile to speak out, but also funnel solutions. One thing speaking out about a problem, but actually now, how do we get people to, what's the answer now? How do we actually change this? So we're not here again this time next year having the exact same discussion and conversation.
Right. And this is a time of great reflection, especially after George Floyd's killing and so many other brutal killings. There has been this, it's created the need, the urgency that always, of course, existed, but now even more so to have these conversations. Amber, to that very point, this year in particular, the BLM movement, all of what is happening, what are the conversations that are happening within the Black community itself? Because we know racism, of course, is often from one race to the other, but colorism is something that can persist within a community. So talking about these issues, what are some of the conversations that are happening now that perhaps weren't happening last year?
I'm not sure if there are new conversations that are happening, because I think that when we speak to Black Lives Matter, we're speaking about Black liberation, right? Black liberation has been a conversation we've been having since, enslavement, since colonialism, since settler colonialism. And so I think that it's not necessarily that we're having new conversations about new topics, but we're finding new ways to communicate what Black liberation means. And I think that with quarantine, with COVID, people are at home, right? They're not participating in capitalism in a way that keeps them preoccupied. They're actually kind of forced, and I hate to use that word forced, but put in a position where they have to actually pay attention to what's happening, right? And so I think that within the Black community, we've been having these conversations about how we've internalized racism, how we've internalized colorism, how we are perpetuating the very things that we're trying to dismantle. And I think that, having the time to go out and protest, having the time to sit online and speak to one another, like we're learning, we're sharing, we're reading, we're educating, and I think we're facing ourselves. ourselves. And we're facing the intersectionalities of our own oppression, whether that's our genders, whether that's our economic statuses, whether that's our sexuality. We're talking more broadly about how Blackness in other ways, how this is affecting us as people. And so I think that I never want to spread this message that we're doing something new. It's not necessarily that we're doing something new. We're just looking at it from a different perspective. We're having these whole conversations about how, if one of us isn't free, none of us are free, right? And so I think that it's really important to distinguish between this is a new thing versus this is a very old conversation that has new facets.
The reason why I put the word new into my question there is because a lot of individuals, a lot of activists say that what is happening right now is unprecedented in terms of the movement. Though this has been happening for decades, the movement itself has this renewed impetus, has this renewed energy. Therefore, keeping in line with that, is there anything that's happening that didn't happen before in terms of the conversations, the way that issues are being addressed? But I take your point there, and it's an important one to have, that these conversations have been happening for a very long time. It's just about if whether or not more people are listening in, are trying to bring about change. Intersectionality, you made that point there, and I just want to talk about that a little more. In all of this, do you think women, those other communities within communities, are getting greater space to voice their concerns, to get people to hear them?
Absolutely. I do think that when we broaden the conversation to include feminism, when we broaden the conversation to include gender identities and sexuality, it complicates the conversation, because then we have to look at the layers of oppression that exist even within Black communities. And so I honestly think what's new, and maybe Jordan has a different perspective, but I honestly think what's new is that quarantine has placed us in this position where we kind of have to talk about it. Many of us are not working, right? We're at home and we're having to deal with the constant videos of Black people being destroyed by the state, and by vigilantes, right? So this is very much something that we can focus on because we're not, overworked or exploited,
right,
through capitalism. And so I do think that, these
right, Amber, I'm short on time. So I just want to get Jordan's perspective on this as well. Jordan, what's your take? What's your understanding of this situation?
I totally agree. I feel like there's two elements here. I think that it's not accurate to suggest that it's anything new. And I take your point to the point earlier on that maybe it's a new type of way we're doing with it. I think two things here is social media. I think social media allows people to have their voice and see things a lot more quicker than they had been before. But I also think that in regards to the question about feminism and women, I think women, and I don't want to talk for women here, but I think women are past now wanting to have their voice heard. I think women, like Black people, want action. It's about, okay, now the difficulties and how the patriarchy works. What's been done to dismantle that? What's been done to change that, to liberate women and Black people and ensure that all those groups of people have an equal chance of succeeding? I think we're past now talking. Everybody now knows the injustice that are happening. Now it's about action. How are we going to actually make change politically and in the business world as well? Because that's what actually top down really, I think a lot of people are asking for. But I also think, just again, the point about people are viewing these videos now a lot more. I don't watch these videos anymore. I've not seen these videos all year. I decided to not watch them. I don't need to watch them. I stopped watching them. But when you're at home because of COVID and because of the lockdown, and you're seeing every single week, in particular from America, another Black person dying, another Black person dying, that I think triggers something in you to think, you know what, the time is now. If not now, then when?
Jordan, I have to end, but just very, very quickly, I'm going to ask you and Amber, you go first, but are you optimistic about this change that you're saying, that people are saying now, enough of what's happened, we need change, we need to see change, we don't want to be in the same position next year that we are in right now. Are you optimistic that that change will come?
I was skeptical at first. I am optimistic because I think there's more young people now leading the charge. and there's more non-Black people leading the charge now. And I think there's an understanding now of what we've been going through. And I am optimistic. Whether it will happen or not, I don't want to put my hat on it, but I'm more optimistic now than I would have been, say, 12 months ago.
Right. You share that optimism?
For any of us who consider ourselves activists, or for any of us who, see, want a future, we're almost required to have this like optimism or this hope. I also think that, non-Black folks are seeing this at their doorsteps as well, right? If the state can commit violence against Black folks, why wouldn't they do the same to you? And I think seeing non-Black people's rights being violated on the streets, or seeing them harmed, especially here in the U.S., seeing the federal government come in and take people in Black vans and, you don't know where they're going, I think that it's to feel like, oh, maybe this can happen to us. So I do share Jordan's, sentiment, and I do have hope, even though, I'm still going to be really critical of like how, the states and people are listening to Black folks.
Both of your voices are so important, and we're so important for our conversation today. Thank you so much, Amber Starks, for joining us, Jordan Jarrett-Bryan for joining us. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.